Britain's pubs in the past weren't just about pulling pints. They were about hearty plates, steaming bowls, and snacks that carried just as much character as the regulars propping up the bar. Some dishes were bold, some were bizarre, but all of them defined an era of pub life that slowly faded away. If even one of these classics brings back a memory, don't forget to subscribe, and let's dive into 15 forgotten pub foods that might just leave you speechless. Few dishes defined the British pub like the Ploughman's lunch. A plate or wooden board stacked with crusty bread, a wedge of sharp cheddar, pickled onions that could make your eyes water, and a dollop of tangy chutney. Sometimes there'd be slices of ham or a crisp apple, adding just the right balance of freshness. It wasn't cooked and it wasn't fancy, and that was exactly its charm. In smoky pubs or quiet country inns, the Ploughman's felt rustic, wholesome, and perfectly matched with a pint of bitter. It carried the taste of tradition, simple and filling, a reminder that sometimes the best pub food needed nothing more than good ingredients and a generous serving of nostalgia. No pub spread of the past felt complete without Scotch eggs. A boiled egg wrapped in herbed sausage meat, rolled in breadcrumbs, and fried until golden brown. It was the perfect balance of snack and meal. Crispy outside, savory and soft inside, they were hearty enough to stand alone, but often served with mustard or chutney on the side. You could find them cold in glass cabinets behind the bar, or warm if the kitchen was running hot plates. Either way, they carried that unmistakable pub charm. Simple, filling, and just a little indulgent. With a pint in hand, biting into a Scotch egg was more than just food. It was a ritual, part of the rhythm of Britain's pub culture that many still miss today. Few snacks felt as rooted in pub culture as the humble pork pie. With its thick, hot watercrust pastry encasing dense, peppery pork, it was a small but mighty treat that paired perfectly with a pint. Many pubs served them straight from the counter, often with a dollop of mustard or a sharp pickled onion on the side to cut through the richness. What truly divided opinion was the layer of jelly set between the meat and pastry. Some loved its savory depth, others pushed it aside, but it always made the pie unforgettable. Cold, hearty, and unapologetically British, pork pies weren't glamorous, yet they symbolized everything a pub snack should be: simple, filling, and steeped in tradition. One of the most iconic dishes to ever grace a pub menu, steak and kidney pudding, was the definition of comfort food. Tender chunks of beef and kidney simmered slowly in rich, dark gravy, then sealed inside a Suet pastry crust that steamed until heavy, soft, and almost melt in the mouth. It arrived at the table piping hot, the steam rising as you cut into the dense crust to reveal the savory filling within. Often served with chips or creamy mash and a ladle of extra gravy, this was food that could silence even the rowdiest pub table after the first bite. It wasn't light and it wasn't elegant, but it was deeply satisfying. A dish made for cold evenings, a roaring fire, and a pint of bitter. For many, steak and kidney pudding was the very essence of British pub dining. Hearty, traditional, and unforgettable. Perhaps the quirkiest of all pub snacks, pickled eggs were impossible to ignore. Sitting in huge glass jars behind the bar, floating in sharp vinegar, they tempted and terrified drinkers in equal measure. Order one, and the bartender would fish it out, plop it into your hand, or drop it straight into a bag of crisps for that classic salty and sour mix. They were cheap, filling, and carried a bite that could make your eyes water. Some swore by them as the perfect partner to a pint of bitter or lager, while others promised they'd never go near the jar. But whether you loved or hated them, pickled eggs were pure pub theatre, a ritual, a dare, and a taste of tradition that still sparks nostalgia today. In countless pubs, the Cornish pasty was the ideal handheld meal. Golden pastry, folded and crimped, filled with a rich mix of beef, potato, onion, and swede. Baked until flaky on the outside and tender inside, it was hearty enough to keep hunger away for hours, the sort of food that felt made for working hands and long evenings. Though born in Cornwall, the pasty spread across Britain and quickly found its place on pub counters. Served warm with a pint, it was rustic and filling, carrying a flavour that spoke of tradition and honest cooking. Pub pasties weren't about refinement, they were about comfort, practicality, and that satisfying bite that paired perfectly with a cold drink after a long day. Once a proud staple of pub kitchens in the north, Lancashire Hotpot was the ultimate one-pot comfort dish. Layers of lamb, onions, and root vegetables baked slowly under a topping of sliced potatoes, which crisped to golden perfection on top, while everything underneath turned soft and rich with flavour. It arrived at the table steaming, usually in a deep bowl, sometimes with pickled red cabbage or crusty bread on the side. This was food built for cold evenings, hearty, filling, and made to linger over with a pint. Simple ingredients, slow cooking, and that unmistakable homely taste made the hot pot more than just a meal. It was a piece of regional pride that carried itself into pub culture across Britain. One of the humblest offerings ever found on a pub table, bread and dripping, was proof that even scraps could become a tradition. Thick slices of bread were spread with the cooled fat left from roasting meat, often flecked with rich jelly or savoury seasoning. For working men stopping in after a shift, it was cheap, filling, and full of flavour. It might not sound glamorous, but in its simplicity lay the charm. A salty, meaty spread paired with a pint of bitter gave comfort without pretense. For many, it was the taste of hard times and honest living, a reminder that pubs weren't just about indulgence. They were about making the most of what you had. Today, it's all but vanished, but the memory of bread and dripping carries a powerful echo of Britain's pub past. Once considered a true delicacy of the old pub menu, Jugged Hare was not for the faint-hearted. The dish involved slow-cooking hare in a rich, wine-based gravy, often with onions, bacon and herbs, until the meat turned dark, tender, and gamey. Traditionally, even the hare's blood was stirred into the sauce, giving it a deep, intense flavor that modern palates might find shocking. It was the kind of dish you'd only see in pubs that prided themselves on tradition, often served with mash or root vegetables to soak up the powerful gravy. Earthy, robust, and unmistakably wild, Jugged Hare carried the essence of Britain's countryside straight to the pub table. Today, it has all but disappeared, but its memory lingers as one of the most daring and old-fashioned dishes ever to grace the bar. A true centerpiece of the traditional pub table, game pie was as rustic as it was hearty. Packed with rabbit, pheasant, venison, or whatever the season offered, the filling was slow-cooked in rich gravy, then sealed under a thick, golden pastry crust. Each bite carried bold, earthy flavors that spoke of the British countryside and the hunting traditions behind it. Served in hefty slices, often alongside pickles or chutney. Game pie was the kind of dish that turned an ordinary pint into a full meal. It wasn't delicate or refined. It was robust, filling, and unapologetically old-fashioned. For many, it represented the very spirit of pub food, communal, comforting, and deeply tied to the rhythms of rural life. A classic example of thrift turned into tradition. Bubble and Squeak was once a familiar sight in pubs across Britain. Made from leftover roast potatoes and cabbage fried together until crisp, it got its name from the cheerful sounds it made in the pan. Golden on the outside and soft inside, it was the perfect way to stretch a Sunday roast into Monday's pint snack. Some pubs served it as a side with sausages or cold meats, while others offered it as a dish on its own, often topped with a fried egg. Simple, cheap, and surprisingly satisfying, Bubble and Squeak carried a homely flavour that felt instantly comforting. For many, it was a reminder that pub food didn't have to be fancy to be memorable. It just had to be hearty and warm. Rich, slow-cooked and deeply comforting, Oxtail Stew was once a regular feature in pub kitchens. Using a cut that many would overlook, the tail was simmered for hours with onions, carrots and herbs until the meat fell from the bone and the broth turned thick and silky. The result was a dish packed with flavour, earthy, hearty, and perfect for soaking up with hunks of bread. It was the kind of stew that filled the air with a mouth-watering aroma, drawing in drinkers from the bar. Served in deep bowls, steaming hot, it offered warmth and nourishment that matched perfectly with a pint on a cold evening. Though it's rare to see today, Oxtail Stew once embodied the very soul of pub cooking, turning humble ingredients into something unforgettable. Once a beloved working-class dish, faggots with peas were a hearty pub staple that carried deep roots in British food culture. Made from minced offal mixed with herbs, breadcrumbs and seasoning, faggots were shaped into balls and baked or simmered in rich onion gravy. Served with a mound of mushy peas and often a scoop of mash, they were filling, cheap, and unapologetically rustic. The flavour was bold, savoury, and comforting, the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs and paired perfectly with a pint of bitter. For many, faggots weren't just food, but a reminder of post-war thrift and family tradition, carried into the pub as an affordable favourite. Today, they're rare outside regional strongholds, but their memory lingers as a dish that defined honest, no-frills pub dining. Thick, heavy, and built to satisfy, Suet crust meat pies were once the backbone of traditional pub food. Unlike flaky puff pastry, the Suet crust was dense and hearty, holding in rich fillings of beef, steak and kidney, or even game. Baked until golden, the crust soaked up the gravy inside, creating a dish that was as comforting as it was filling. Served in generous slices with mash, peas, and a pint on the side, these pies were meals in themselves, warming, affordable, and deeply tied to Britain's culinary past. They weren't elegant, but they didn't need to be. Suet pies carried the flavour of old-fashioned pub kitchens, where food was about sustenance, tradition, and that satisfying feeling of leaving the table full. No list of forgotten pub foods would be complete without bread pudding, the sweet, dense dessert that turned leftovers into something unforgettable. Made by soaking stale bread in milk, sugar, eggs, and spices, then baking it until golden and firm, it was cheap to make yet rich in flavour. Raisins or currants often dotted the slices, and a dusting of sugar on top gave it that final touch of comfort. Served warm in thick slabs, sometimes with custard, bread pudding was the kind of treat that rounded off a heavy pub meal perfectly. It carried the taste of home baking, a reminder that nothing went to waste, and that even the simplest ingredients could create nostalgia. Today, it's rare to find on pub menus, but for many, bread pudding remains one of the sweetest echoes of Britain's pub tradition.